Welcome back to Carolina Journal Radio. I'm Mitch Kokai. He left office 20 years ago, but the late President Ronald Reagan still exercises a major influence over American politics and public policy. Why? Our next guest has explored that question in a 2-volume narrative history of the 40th president titled The Age of Reagan. Stephen Hayward is F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute and Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute for Public Policy. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, why? Why is Reagan so much of an influence over our politics and public policy?
Well, I think he is a large figure in every sense of the word. His personality was large, but especially his politics. And I think he ranks with Franklin Roosevelt as the other dominant pivotal president of the 20th century. I mean, he changed our course in a number of ways. But over the last 20 years since he left office, there's been a bit of confusion has arisen about him. Liberals start to like part of him while disliking other parts. And conservatives sometimes want to remember the good parts and forget some of the more difficult parts of the Reagan administration and have sort of lost their focus a little bit on him. So I wanted to write a long book that told the whole story and not just parts of it, and directed our attention to some of the frustrations that are still frustrating to conservatives today. How do we control big government? How do we restore the Constitution within its proper bounds, and so forth? Those are questions Reagan wrestled with some successes and with some failures and with some ties.
You called it a long book, and for those who haven't seen it, actually the two books together, if I count correctly, there's about 1,500 pages on Ronald Reagan. What are some of the main things you learned during the course of your research that most people don't really know about Reagan?
Right. Well, I would say about both candidate Reagan in the 70s and then President Reagan is part of his art was concealing how hard he worked and how much he knew. And he did that for some odd reasons. One, he wanted the Americans to have the feeling that the president had things under control. So one of his favorite jokes was, they say hard work never killed anyone, but I say, why take chances? Turned out he worked really hard, often till midnight, reading documents, marking up speeches, writing his own speeches and lots of letters. He was also a very disciplined person in his practice. So people would say, gosh, Reagan doesn't say anything in meetings. And sometimes he did say a lot in meetings. That wasn't universally true. But one of the reasons he didn't say things in many meetings is that he didn't want to read what he'd said in a newspaper the next day because he hated leaks and knew that if he said anything important at a meeting, it would be in the paper the next day. That takes some real discipline on the part of a president to understand that. I think it's people who like to point to Reagan as their example ought to study really hard how he prepared for his speeches, the structure of his speeches. They're often shorter than a lot of political speeches that people make today, like Bill Clinton, who can rival Fidel Castro sometimes, right? Reagan made it look so easy that I think we think that it should come easy to the rest of us, and it really doesn't. He had to work very hard to be as good as he was.
For those of us who are involved in this public policy world, it might also be interesting to note that Ronald Reagan, though known as among the left as an amiable dunce or a fellow who didn't know much about things, really was very interested in the principles involved in policy and the work of Bastiat and Hayek and those sorts of folks?
That's an extremely important point. I think what you'd say is Reagan was not an intellectual in the sort of ordinary sense we think of that term, but he was a man of ideas, and that's a hugely important point. He was a sponge for reading, interesting studies and articles by leading conservative thinkers. He picked from a lot of conservative thinkers to have important posts in the administration. I mean, one of the best examples was Jeane Kirkpatrick, the UN ambassador, who he picked because he loved her article in Commentary magazine in 1989 on dictatorships and double standards. She was a Democrat still and lured her over to the Republican Party. So he was very much alive to the world of ideas, and I think that also is a very important thing. He wasn't just a politician of tactics. I think the most important point about Reagan, if you look closely, is he really understood what he was trying to do as restoring the founders' understanding of our Constitution and how the government ought to operate. In the 1970s, he used to like to say that the way we now have administrative government and bureaucracy that writes laws for us has, he wrote, in effect repealed portions of the Constitution. He said in his first inaugural address that the government now operates in ways that extend beyond the consent of the governed, that great phrase from the Declaration of Independence. So he understood our problems. It's not just bad policy, but bad constitutionalism.
That is the voice of Stephen Hayward from the American Enterprise Institute and Pacific Research Institute, also author of The Age of Reagan, the two-part narrative history, the second part now out. If you'd like to hear what he has to say again, you can listen to the Carolina Journal Radio podcast. Just log on to carolinajournalradio.com. There you'll find more information about the podcast. It is available each week. Now, some people who follow politics today and some of those who are listening to this program will say, geez, Reagan, why are we hearing so much about Reagan? What do we need to know about President Reagan and what he did that can affect and influence what we do today?
Well, one of the things I point to in the book is what I'm calling nowadays Reagan's unfinished agenda. In his second term, he understood that he had not been fully successful in controlling the growth of spending and the growth of government, and he worried that successive presidents after him would be even less resolved than he was to try and control the growth of government, and he turned out to be completely right about that for presidents from both parties. So starting in 1987, he said, I think we need to have 5 constitutional amendments. 2 he talked about a lot, a balanced budget amendment and a line item veto for the president so they could strip out pork barrel and earmarks and things like that. But he had 3 others. He wanted a supermajority requirement, like 2/3, for Congress to approve any tax increases. He said we ought to have a constitutional spending limit, so the federal government could not spend over a certain amount of our economy, because we want to do more and more of that all the time. And then finally, he said we ought to have a constitutional ban on wage and price controls. Now, that's the really interesting one to me, because in the late 80s, nobody was talking about bringing back wage and price controls. But here today, under President Obama, we're controlling the wages of bankers, and if he has his way, we'll soon be controlling all the prices of the healthcare sector, and not just some of the prices as we do now.
Speaking of the wage and price controls in the Obama administration, an interesting story I heard about Ronald Reagan was one that he delivered a speech to some former advisors back in the late 70s, before he became president, talking about how any Democrat who's elected to be president, even if they want to govern as a moderate, they're never going to be able to do it.
Right.
What can you tell us about what he said about Democrats elected to be president?
Well, one of the things about Reagan that made him, I think, successful, especially in his first term, is that he campaigned very clearly on what he wanted to do. He said, I want to cut taxes, I want to shrink government, and he was very specific about his ideas. By contrast, the last 3 Democratic presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and now Barack Obama, all campaigned as moderates, very vague about what they wanted to do. And even in the case of Carter and Clinton, who had some moderate instincts, the interest groups in their party and the liberal leadership on Capitol Hill pulled them relentlessly to the left. The Democratic Party, it's impossible to govern as a centrist for very long in the Democratic Party. The only reason Bill Clinton was able to move to the center is because he had a Republican Congress that made it possible. He wouldn't have governed that way if the Democrats had kept control of Congress.
Our time is winding down, but as you think about all of the issues related to Ronald Reagan that you've studied, what is the one thing that you want people to know about Ronald Reagan that would be helpful for today's current political debates?
I describe Reagan's central political insight as being the idea that political power is a threat to liberty, both in its totalitarian forms, like the Soviet Union, but also in its supposedly benign forms, like big government bureaucracy. And he expressed it that way a lot. See, a lot of the liberals who like Reagan try and make 2 Reagans out of him. The foreign policy Reagan, who they say was a closet liberal, which isn't true, and this domestic policy Reagan, who they don't like because he was for tax cuts and small government. I argue that his statecraft on foreign and domestic policy have to be understood as a unity because he saw it as a unity, and all his ideas generated from that one insight that applied across the board.
That is Stephen Hayward, F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute, Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute, and author of the 2-volume The Age of Reagan. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more on Carolina Journal Radio in just a moment.